Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. I hope you're happy, healthy and well. It is time for a new book review today. And today I have the pleasure of sharing some of the lessons learned in Anita Heiss's new book called Bila Yoranda Langalajare. I'm sorry, I know I said that incorrectly, but you're probably wondering, wow, that is a long title. And yeah, it's probably the longest title I've ever seen in a book. But the language, if you're asking the question about where it comes from, it is from the Wiradjuri language. And the Wiradjuri language, I found out, unfortunately, how stupid is this? Being an Australian, I should have known this, but it is one lesson I learned out of this book. The Wiradjuri Nation is the second largest Indigenous culture nation here in Australia, which takes up all of central New South Wales. And indeed, this book has a lot of Wiradjuri terms and references in here. So reading about those was fantastic because it opened my eyes to something I should have known as an Australian here. But I'm going to hazard to guess that there's a lot of Australians who probably didn't know this anyway, and I'll come back to that reason. Now, this book is quite new, and Anita Heiss is an Australian author who comes from a background with, she's of the Wiradjuri Nation. And so a lot of that is mentioned in this book are references and words of her culture. I love this book. I really love this book, and it immersed me straight away into a perspective of a young black woman serving a white family in Gundagai back in 1852. Now, Gundagai, for those who might not be aware, is in central New South Wales here in Australia. And it is a story, it's loosely based on a true story of the Gundagai floods back in 1852, which was one of the worst floods, resulting in hundreds of people dying and the decimation of a town. Now, at that time, the local Indigenous culture had said to the whites, don't build here. This is a floodplain. It's going to get flooded. The Murrumbidgee River is going to break its banks and the entire area will flood. Now, they knew this simply because they had been there thousands of years before whites had ever settled there. But did the whites listen? No, of course not. They didn't listen. And so what happened? Well, the floods happened and all this decimation occurred. Now, this story, though, is from the perspective of this young black girl called Wagadine, and she works with a white family, and her father helps this white family in saving their lives during the floods. But what happens is this family takes her away to Wagga Wagga, so removes her from her clan, from her Miyan, her family, and takes her into another part of the country, still being of Wiradjuri Nation. But she feels so homesick and so disconnected from that place simply because she is immersed into a white family, into the white culture, that she desperately seeks and craves her family back at home at Gundagai, but she also meets the local Indigenous culture there on the river bank, where she starts to settle in and find this new family. So this book is really about a whole heap of different themes. It is the view of colonialism from the perspective of a young black female, and also from the perspective of a white character, a female character called Louise, who was a Quaker. Now, Quakers at the time were people who believed in equality. They didn't drink, they didn't gamble, but they were there and they taught the Indigenous cultures to read, but they also were interested in equality between whites and blacks. So I think, you know, if I was living at that time, I would probably be a Quaker myself. It was really interesting to read it from the point of view of Louisa and also the point of view of Wagadine, and how sometimes, although they tried to learn from each other and learn their ways from the two female perspectives, there was always, I guess, a barrier, an obstacle, or somewhere where they just didn't mix, and that was simply because they came from two completely different modes of thinking and completely two different civilizations and two different societies. And these societies were at one spectrum of each other. I would say the Quakers were kind of in the middle, but on the whole though, being a white, the color of the skin, and what was afforded by way of privilege to the people with white skin was very different to those with the black. So to me, it was a representation of the disconnection, but also trying to understand the ways of each other, but somehow not making sense in any way. There was always some kind of barrier, and that barrier, I believe, was the color of the skin, and for the time, what privileges were afforded to those people based on the color of their skin. Now, this book, I'm not going to go into details about the whys and wherefores of what is this book about, but obviously, like I said, in this YouTube channel, I think about the lessons that I learned as I read this book. The first thing that came to mind for me was kind of like being ashamed that I don't know. As an Australian, I don't know enough about Indigenous culture, Aboriginal culture, simply because we weren't taught it at school. I mean, I'm of an age when I was at school in the 70s and the 80s, and this wasn't in the curriculum. We didn't know about Welcome to Country. We didn't know about the customs. We didn't know about the Dreamtime. It was a very foreign world, and it was never mentioned. Only in recent times, thankfully, we're starting now to get more and more Aboriginal and Indigenous culture into references of our Australian everyday life. And indeed, we're at a point in time here in Australian history that even we will have a referendum to change the constitution to include the black voice in our constitution. And currently in Australia, this is what everyone is discussing. And there is a bit of, hoo-ha about it. But ultimately, I know that I'm for that. And despite not knowing enough about it, I know enough that the time has come now to actually understand and accept that the Indigenous culture should and must have a voice here in Australia. Now, the book really made me think about the different perspectives, and I like the fact that it didn't come from a one or the other. In actual fact, it made me really sit and think about how white people have actually lost in some way, and are probably now feeling, I'm not going to say the level of disconnection that the blacks felt back then, but I do feel that we have come to a point in time in our history that we are starting to feel as a population, and I'm not speaking for everyone, I'm just speaking for me, obviously, that we have somehow, given that we've stripped the resources of the land, that there's climate change, there is impact and destruction to our world, that we've somehow completely disconnected with the land. And I feel that the Indigenous cultures back then were so attuned to a very harsh country due to thousands of years of being and living on the land and coming to appreciate what the land provides for them by way of food, by way of protection, by way of water, by way of, I don't know, there was some kind of spiritualism that we're somehow missing in today's world. And I do believe that we have discounted our Indigenous cultures, whether they are the Australian Indigenous cultures or the cultures in other countries, that we've somehow discounted them in some way, believing that they were uninformed, that they were not involved to the point of the white people. But in so doing, where have we come to in this world? And so I believe now that the local and Indigenous cultures had the right idea about the land, had the right idea about the earth, and that we have so much to learn from them. But somehow, maybe it is too late. Maybe it is at a point now that we've disconnected them so much that we're all in this trough of uncertainty and not knowing what to do or how to do it, but knowing that we feel as if something's amiss. And so reading this book, I thought to myself that I need to learn more about Indigenous cultures, and I need to be open and ask a lot of questions, and at least understand that, we've come to a point in time in history. It is what it is now. We've so evolved to a point that we can't go backwards. But at the same time, I think going forward, it is up to us to start being more open, more accepting, asking questions, more in tune with different voices, and coming from a place of accepting that we don't have the right answers. Just because the color of my skin is white, I don't know. I don't have the right answers, but I'm willing to ask the questions and come from a place of, asking the questions and understanding different points of view. I'm not afraid of people in the color of skin. I just know my limitations. And I like the character here in this book who was able to, keep to herself in some way, and in a sense that she observed a lot and she asked questions, but she had someone who she can ask questions to, and someone who helped her along the way, whether it was her family, but also Louisa, who I felt was initially, I had a very skeptical view of Louisa because I didn't understand her true intentions, what she and why she wanted to try and teach and change the ways of the Indigenous cultures here. In actual fact, Louisa goes on her own transformative personal journey herself, which is what I love. So this book was a great one. I encourage people to read this. Don't be afraid of the Aboriginal words, because as you read the book, you start to understand what they are talking about and what they are referring to, even though there is a glossary right at the end. I didn't need to use the glossary, although it was interesting reading. I love this book, and I think this book has now a time and place for it here in Australia. I think if you want to get involved and learn more about the Indigenous culture, but you don't want to go heavily into, I guess, more non-fiction books, I think presenting it in the way that Anita Heiss has done is a brilliant way of trying to understand a very quiet, perspective of both sides and the difficulties that were placed on the Black people at the time. Look, I highly recommend this book. One of the best reads I read in 2023. One of my favourite book club books. So that is my review and my lessons learnt from Bila Yarudanga-Langadjere. So there you have it. Have you read this book? Let me know what you think. Have you read any other books that make reference to the Aboriginal culture? Let me know. I'd be interested to find out more, because this is something that I need to learn and I need to understand and I need to know being an Australian. I simply have no excuse of learning and understanding the Indigenous culture of the country that I live. I really have no excuse. So thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Bye for now.